15, verses 2 through 16. But Abram said, "Lord God, what can you possibly give me, since I still have no children? The head of my household is Eliezer, a man from Damascus." He continued, "Since you haven't given me any children, the head of my household will be my heir." The Lord's word came immediately to him. "This man will not be your heir. Your heir will definitely be your very own biological child." Then he brought Abram outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars if you think you can count them." He continued, "This is how many children you will have." Abram trusted the Lord, and the Lord recognized Abram's high moral character. He said to Abram, "I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession." But Abram said, "Lord God, how do I know that I will actually possess it?" He said, "Bring me a 3-year-old female calf, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a dove, and a young pigeon." He took all of these animals, split them in half, and laid the halves facing each other, but he didn't split the birds. When vultures swooped down on the carcasses, Abram waved them off. After the sunset, Abram slept deeply. A terrifying and deep darkness settled over him. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Have no doubt that your descendants will live as immigrants in a land that isn't their own, where they will be oppressed slaves for 400 years. But after I punish the nation they serve, they will leave it with great wealth. As for you, you will join your ancestors in peace and be buried after a good long life. The 4th generation will return here, since the Amorites' wrongdoing won't have reached its peak until then." Our second reading is Luke 15, 20b through 24. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, hugged him, and kissed him. Then his son said, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Fetch the fattened calf and slaughter it. We must celebrate with feasting, because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate.
As we begin this series on the Jesus Creed, we're going to talk about God's love for us. And I often wonder, what image of God's love do you have in your mind and in your heart? If you were like me and you said, you know, this year I'm going to do something new. For the Lenten season, I'm going to start reading through the good book, and you start on page 1. It doesn't take you long to get through this to go, oh, God is angry with us, right? God floods the earth, doesn't he? And how does our faith reflect the very nature of the God that we wish to talk about? Well, you know, growing up, I think of my own father. I think about the times in which he had to correct my behavior as a child, and it wasn't always pleasant for me in life. He wasn't always right, but we'll talk about that with him later. But I think for many of us, the stumbling block when we hear about the first person of the Trinity, God the Father, is our understanding of our own Father. And so when we talk about the love of God, what does that leave us with? And I know that there are some here who have had probably less than desirable, would be a really kind of mild way of stating what their father, or their experience with their father, if they had one, growing up. If we're called to be Christ-like, Christian, that's the term we give it, we are called to reflect the very nature of God. So how do we reconcile, is what we're going to talk about today, this image of the Old Testament God and the image of the New Testament God that we have. I was attending in my first appointment, my first church, a men's Bible study, and they told me this story one day that was hilarious, but also very reflective. They said that the pastor one day, it was not uncommon for the congregation, or for at least for the attendees of the Bible study, when the early morning Bible study had ended, to invite the pastor out to breakfast. And once a month or so, we would go and have a table meal with them. One guy who was hilarious, Kevin, couldn't tell you a joke without start laughing before he even got halfway through it, and it was generally as funny as he advertised it to be. Was telling jokes one day, I don't remember, it seemed to be a little inappropriate joke, and we started laughing about it, and he was like, "Oh, sorry, Pastor, you're here today." And we started talking about how our nature reflects the very God that we have, and they said, several pastors ago, we invited the pastor out to, breakfast like we did with you today. And the waitress came, and she was good at memorizing your order. If you'd been there more than 3 times, she was there. Well, this particular participant was there who was new, and so she was kind of getting the feel of what they like to eat in the morning. And so they did their order, and we don't know who screwed up, whether it was the kitchen, and she may have grabbed the wrong plate. I'm not sure what it was, but the plate came back to the table, and it was nothing close to what had been ordered. And now this gal knew that these were all good God-fearing men, Methodists from the church, who just came from Bible study. And this one gentleman who got the wrong meal just went off on her. I guess it was rather attention-getting, or attention, everyone in the restaurant was looking. And he was like, "This is ridiculous. How do you expect to get paid? Blah, 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 blah." And she apologized, took the meal back. "We'll get it straightened out. I'm so sorry, And whenever we walked away, the pastor just kind of subtly leaned over to him, and it was one of those moments when the whole table and the whole restaurant seemed to go quiet. And so his voice, which wasn't intended to, carried throughout the restaurant, and he whispered to his friend, "Now when she gets back, witness to her." I wish I was that clever. But it obviously, and I believe it was Reverend Wiltshire, actually, as I remember. He served here too. It was the one who did that. If you remember Reverend Wiltshire. So, how does our nature, this idea of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your strength, your mind, and loving your neighbor as yourself, play out in everyday world situations? Well, we have to start first with kind of understanding who God is and what the nature of God is. And as I turn to the Old Testament, I look at, the one that we knew at the time, God the Father, right? The one that we call God the Father today. His power is seen through his through his creation, right? He speaks into creation all that is. Now I'm telling you, I've spoken into a lot of things, but nothing ever has materialized. I don't know how many times in the office I've asked for the box of $1 million to show up, but it hasn't paid. We think Pat's hiding it somewhere. God is this rule setter. I don't know how you are, but my dad seemed to set a lot of rules in the house, and they didn't always seem to be fair. But God gives the commandments, doesn't he? As we see the God says, all right, and I hear a lot of restriction in that language, thou shalt and thou shalt not language. And so Israel understood not only 10 commandments, but through the whole Torah, 619 rules that they had to follow continuously. I don't know about you, but if Dad had given me 619 rules to follow, I'm not sure how well I would have done. Then there was the first rule, right? The first rule is you can have anything in the garden you want. Don't eat from the tree of knowledge in the center of it. Now, what kind of temptation? I mean, you tell a kid, don't touch the hot stove, you'll get burned. They head right for what is hot, right? Trying to figure that out. That's where reverse psychology comes in. We tell them, don't eat the beets on your table when they're starting to eat solid foods, right? And then when they realize it tastes like dirt, they learn and they don't eat it anymore. And don't let Danny next week bring his famous meatloaf, okay? It's just, he talks about it in every prayer meeting, I think. Then we know the God who seems to be punitive, right? This God who floods the earth to rid it of evil. This God who seems to punish and destroy. The rains don't come Children, livestock, our future security is not there because God seems to be angry with us, right? There's people who die in the desert for what seems to be kind of, Even his faithful one, Moses, when he takes credit for the water coming out of a rock, is then forbidden from entering into the promised land. God seems to be a pretty punitive, pretty judgmental, pretty stay by the rules or else. We see this God who's a protector. He provides passage for the Israelites right into the promised land through the pillar of smoke by day and the pillar of light by night, but he leads them on the longest. I don't think God had GPS. He leads them on a 40-year journey, and a journey that would have taken less than 40 days. This wandering people through a desert, generation after generation die before they finally achieve the promised land. But they know and believe, as long as God is with us, who can be against us? So there is this sense in the patriarchal society of a sense of provision and protection. But God is also unapproachable. Right? Moses, even when he's on the mountain, has to hide in the cleft of a rock, because if he even sees God, then he will surely die. This sense of the pillar moving into the temple when Solomon finally builds the temple for God and rests in the Holy of Holies. Friends, if you had to go and you were the high priest that year and leave the offering on the altar as Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, requires you, they tied a rope around your waist in case you fainted or fell out so they could pull you out, so no one else had to enter. I mean, this God is so powerful. If you even see him, if you even turn back, you'll end up like Lot's wife, right? A pillar of salt. God is clearly a God of judge and jury, and requires such respect and reverence that the Israelites can't even pronounce his name. Even in writing, they spell it without the vowels. And so when Jesus turns and he says, I am in Hebrew is Yahweh. Jesus is proclaiming the name of God, which is unheard of for somebody. God is a warrior who fights battles through 1 Kings and 1 Chronicles for the Israelites as they seem to take on unsurmountable odds. But God to me also seems like a God who plays favorites. Right? He creates us, we screw up, then he sorts us out. And so Israel is always known as God's favorite. And there always is a sense of judgment, just in the text today, that Abram, because of his faith, and his generations will be blessed. But what about the other generations? And what message does that mean for those who have yet to accept? Well, we know that if we don't accept, we as Christians believe that we're doomed to not live eternally in heaven. And what does that say about God? What does that say about the God who allows in a conversation with Satan punishment and destruction on Job and all that he has? We wrestle with the fairness or the justness of God. We're asked to kind of accept his will and his decision, but at times it's really hard for us, isn't it? When things seem unfair. We hear the psalmist speak of a God who's slow to anger. And I wonder for a minute, if I only had the Hebrew scriptures to describe God, what kind of image would I be left with? I think we in the Christian faith, post-Jesus, lose sight of the radicalness of Jesus' message. Just how out there he is when he speaks of, for instance, in the prodigal son story, a father who's so loving and nurturing and caring. No matter how much his son screws up. And I think we lose sight if we were to be people who were raised in the Jewish tradition, in the days after Jesus resurrected with these disciples, telling stories of this Jesus guy who said, God is so different from what you know or understand. lose that sense of, what? After all, Judaism taught, you follow the rules, God will be pleased. You don't follow the rules, you better have a lot of sacrifices. Because it's only through giving over and giving up that God's relationship with you can be restored. And these early disciples come in and say, no, 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 no. You don't understand. So when Jesus is asked the greatest commandment, and he turns and says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your soul, with all your mind. Love meant obedience. Love meant reverence. But Jesus starts to use this term more frequently in the scriptures than anyone else when he refers to the Father as Abba, this intimate sense of who God is. And the radical claim of the early disciples over the fact that they ate with God. That he washed their feet. That they were along when he raised the dead, healed the sick, restored the blind. And he turned the tables on a money exchange system that just seemed to be the only fair way for people to make an offering to God. And that the practice in some of its core ways of Judaism was no longer necessary. Because the God of love came and resided with us. I think we lose the sense of, what? That goes into the message of the early Christian church. God is unapproachable, and you claim that you slept next to him? You claim that you ate from the same plate? You claim to have walked and talked, to be fed spiritually, emotionally, physically by him? In the storms of life, he just spoke a word and the waters became calm. Invited you into a ministry of healing that only God can provide, and you went 2 by 2? Are you kidding me? But the most radical nature of God is seen in the second half of our scripture today in the New Testament. The God whose Son has come in a very selfish way, representing our own personal agendas in life, right? I want what's coming to me, give it to me now, his Son says to his Father, and goes off and squanders it. The Son would have squandered 1/3 of his Father's estate. He knows what's waiting for him when he gets home. And realizes that he has no right to even ask for a place at the table, but takes on the heart of a servant, if his Father would let him. When his plan fails, he has no other choice but to lean upon the love of the Father. And as he's coming around the corner, a long way off, his Father sees him and runs for him. A Father who's been waiting for his Son to return. The Son comes with this speech all prepared. God, you know, Father, I'm just not worthy to be. And what he finds is the embrace of a Father who restores him in family status and throws a celebration. But we know what the celebration looks like, don't we? Because we've been told in Luke 15 and 2 other stories what it's like when a shepherd leaves the 99 for the one who's lost, or a woman who loses 1/10 of her wealth and then finds it. The scriptures tell us, for there is more rejoicing in heaven at the return of one. There is more rejoicing in heaven at the one who is lost than the 99 who lived a righteous life. That this heart of God yearns for us to come home. That he's waiting a long way off and will not leave us in our state. But as we come confessionally to a place in which we seek to be in some way just even enslaved, just in some way just in distant association with the Father, his loving embrace comes around us. He seeks as the approachable, all-loving, all-giving, all-forgiving, all-restoring God to say to us, I don't want to hear it. You're home. Let's celebrate. We don't gather here each week and worship for something we need, but for all that we've been given. We gather to worship him. We gather to recognize the God who shouldn't, but did. We recognize the God who came to express his true nature in the person of Jesus Christ. The Godhead as one. That the rules were made for our own safety and security. That we might live in community with one another. And he came to spread the message. It's not just what you might perceive as the favorites. Let's acknowledge most of us probably wouldn't be here, right? I'm not sure about my family heritage, but I don't know how far back it goes to see if there's a Jew anywhere in our, if I would have been a part of the chosen family, I would have probably been, most likely, a Gentile. God says there's more to what we have to offer. It's not just for some, but for all. Remember, I created it and said it was good. I gave you the earth. I gave you life. I breathed into you my very nature, my very spirit, your soul that had been yearning to come home forever. Remember the day you came home. Can you imagine what it's going to be like in heaven? To be a part of the party that we see that takes place when one is lost and comes home. We couldn't be there in our own party, our initial birthday party, if you will. But we will be there because when he finally comes, it's going to be a party like none other. I believe it. Spartans and Buckeyes alike. I'll let you figure out which one was lost and is now found. We'll have that conversation at coffee. How about that? But my friends, we lose touch with just how radical Jesus is, just how radical his message is. And we might turn and say, but God flooded the earth, but God saved humanity. We look at one way or another, and Wesley always chose to look at the saving work of God. He didn't leave the Israelites enslaved. Isn't it interesting that Joshua led them into the promised land, and Joshua in the Greek is Jesus. But Joshua and Jesus are the same name. But the one who led God's chosen into the promised land is named after or for the one who would lead us into the promised land. The very nature of who God is to be loving, to be forgiving, to be grace-filled. He only asks of us one thing. Come home. And he's inviting us in the same way he invited the early disciples to follow him. What would life look like if we were sitting at the table and a waitress screwed our order up and we were seeking to reflect that very nature of God? I think it would be a lot easier to witness to her when she came back, wouldn't you? God always has our best interest and our best future in mind. Let us spend this week in worship with hearts of appreciation, with minds set upon spreading the good news of the love, the nature of the one we worship, not just here, but always and everywhere. What a life it'll be, because we know where we're going. God has a party planned for us, and I don't want to miss it. The praise band is going to come forward this morning to lead us in the acts of worship today. You know, these faithful saints come even on the days in which worship might seem to be a distant thought, and we thank them for their beautiful gift of service and leading us each day. It doesn't prevent us from following their lead and for worshiping the God who loves us more than we know. Let's put that into practice, shall we?
Let us take this time to make a proclamation that He's King of our heart. Let the King of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, He is my song. Let the King of my heart be the shadow